I knew you'd come.
I like games, and I like the stories of games. As a medium, there are several advantages games have as a form of storytelling, like their ability to be immersive, to actively involve players in events, or to allow players to shape these events. Getting to play for a story can be special in a way that reading about or watching a story never can be. But the cold, hard truth of stories in games is that, in general, they really aren't very well written. But that's not the writer's fault, it's the fault of the medium. A book is written by a single author. That means one person has complete control of every part of the story to tell it the way they want to. Everything can be deliberate, everything can be planned out, nothing needs to be compromised, there are no external limitations, and the story can always be the priority. Now compare that to video games. Even the writing staff will be multiple people, so already writing a story becomes a team effort where sharing the same vision and working jointly towards that vision presents a challenge. But then you have the rest of the development team, and they will face their own problems, and a game's story can't always be prioritized. Compromises do have to be made, and the writers may find they have far less control than they want to. Often a story will have to fit around gameplay, rather than the other way around, and the necessity of gameplay places huge limitations on that story. Stories end up changing over the course of a game's development, and that change is usually for the worse. Deadlines for games are very real, and they will nearly always lead to cut content of some kind. Sometimes writers just have to do the best they can, but the writing does suffer as a result. So there are advantages to games as a form of storytelling, but there are also clear disadvantages. And the unfortunate result of this is that game stories often don't feel worthy of deep critical analysis in the same way as those told by film or literature. And that is unfortunate because there's a lot that can be said in favour of that type of analysis. In overthinking things, in looking for hidden meaning, in questioning the small details. But in a game, you often have to ask yourself if something is the way it is, not because of the story, but because that's what the gameplay needed. For example, in the Witcher books, monsters are rare and are dying out. Yet, in the games, monsters are everywhere. This isn't because the game's writers want to retcon this aspect of the story. It's because the game needs to give the player regular enemies to fight, and so the world has been packed with monsters for the benefit of gameplay. Characters can be similar. If characters act a certain way, it may not be a true reflection of their character. It may just be because it fits better into the game's design. For example, Geralt in the books often tries not to get involved in things, yet in the games he'll happily go out of his way to solve all sorts of small problems, because how else is the game going to give the player those all-important side quests? So compromises are just a reality of writing a game story. And as a result, not every part of a game story feels tightly written. Themes aren't always consistent, nor are characters, and the small details can't be relied upon to be deliberate decisions for the sake of the story, because stories are so often forced to take a back seat to gameplay, financial costs, and deadlines. But this video isn't about storytelling or writing in games. It's about the first DLC of The Witcher 3, Hearts of Stone. Regardless, I hope this slightly off-topic introduction is worth it because I really want to get this point across. There is a problem with storytelling in games as a result of the medium that shows itself time and time again and often brings down the quality of writing and storytelling compared to other mediums. If the point of this video is to try and explain why Hearts of Stone is so good, then the answer is pretty simple. It's because the story doesn't feel like it's the result of many compromises. The writing is good. The details do feel deliberate. The themes are consistent. And the end result very much feels worthy of deeper analysis, with a story that rewards you for paying attention, features complex and interesting characters, and can be interpreted multiple ways. And that is a great achievement. That alone makes this story better than an awful lot of those seen in games. And the reason for this may well be because Hearts of Stone is DLC. DLC as a concept has often been criticised, and I myself have quite a negative opinion of it at times. But DLC does have its advantages. It can allow for developers to be required to do less, and therefore be able to do one thing better, like telling a good story. And it can allow for greater freedom in storytelling and allow for a story to be more focused. There are other advantages of DLC, but it's really these things that are important to Hearts of Stone because this DLC is all about the story it tells. and it does feel like a story that could only be told through DLC. And so Hearts of Stone really does stand as a perfect example of why DLC is important, because even if there is a lot of cash grabs and mediocre DLC out there, when the good DLC is this good, it's hard to be too negative. Also, this video will look at Hearts of Stone's story in its entirety, and so it will be full of spoilers. Before any encounters with impossible wishes or evil incarnate, Hearts of Stone begins with a contract. A Witcher contract, much like any other, that the player picks up and then sets about fulfilling its terms by slaying a monster. Hearts of Stone is a story about many things, but the role of contracts and deals are a pretty important part, and it's fitting that this is how this tale begins. We're introduced to the contracts poster, Olgierd von Everec, in a scene that gives the player more questions than answers. Although later we'll learn the truth about this character, initially it's unclear what role he'll play, and that uncertainty is deliberately maintained for most of the DLC's length. His commentary on the stone statue encapsulates Olgierd's main dilemma, where once he can enjoy its pristine beauty, that same quality now means nothing to him, and its flawless form seems boring, just like everything else in his life now as a result of his immortality. But for now, the player won't know this, and the main question they'll be wondering is whether they can trust this new character. And of course, you shouldn't. The contract has you killing a toad in what is a great and actually very challenging boss fight. This is something the series has seriously lacked, and this fight is a lot of fun. Unlike most enemies in the main game, you actually do need to pay attention to the toad's attacks, and dodging requires you to learn the boss's moves and attack pattern. Quen is also pretty weak here, and as the toad makes for a difficult encounter, this fight works well at making the player think about their strategy, and encouraging them to make use of any advantage they have available. However, while this fight is fun to play through, its outcome doesn't play out so well for Geralt. This contract, it seems, comes with some small print that no one decided to tell you. The toad is actually a cursed prince, and upon killing it, Geralt is immediately captured by the prince's men, who just so happen to turn up at this exact moment. Almost as if something, or someone, guided their hand. You end up as a prisoner on a ship that's taken you away to answer for your crime. The situation seems dire until the other central character of this story, Gaunter O'Dim, steps in to help you out with an offer you have little choice but to accept. He promises to help you escape if you'll later return the favour and do something for him. The appearance of Gaunter O'Dim here is made far more interesting by the fact that it's not the player's first meeting with him. We first meet him in White Orchard, in an event that the player has likely forgotten about before this reminder, but its existence makes the story feel a whole lot more deliberate. Like it's not just some add-on story for the sake of selling DLC, it was something that had been planned, but had already been started. It makes the player wonder if there are more important details they may have forgot, and it might make you pay more attention to other details as a result. And there is a lot to pay attention to, with plenty of foreshadowing and subtle references to events and characters. Geralt escapes after killing his capturers thanks to the intervention of a storm, leaving open the possibility that your escape could just be a coincidence. But that possibility doesn't remain long, as your next meeting with Gaunter O'Dim will show that this man is a lot more than he seems. Although what he is and where your association with him will take you remains to be seen, as does the extent of his power and evilness. These things are slowly revealed, but initially both his power and wickedness seem somewhat downplayed. This is part of what makes him so interesting. Gaunter O'Dim tries to persuade you to help him with reason and logic, arguing Olgierd is evil and needs to be stopped. He appeals to your sense of fairness. He did help you after all, and he only wants what Olgierd owes him. He's also respectful. He doesn't order you to help him, he asks you. He's polite. He compliments Geralt, offers him rewards, and he knows exactly what the player wants most.
But above all, I offer a great, true adventure. An experience like no other, the fate of only the chosen few.
And in return, he asks only that you fulfill your deal to help him and be honest with him, which seems a reasonable request. In the next scene with Olgierd, Gaunter maintains his respectfulness, even bowing to Olgierd, and the fact he needs Geralt's help makes you question his power. In some ways this is a facade, hiding his true self, but both his power and evilness aren't simple things, and we'll come back to both later. In this scene you also learn of Olgierd's immortality, and we're introduced to the main premise of the DLC, the need to fulfill 3 near impossible wishes for Olgierd to pay our debt to Gaunter. This situation makes it deliberately unclear who the true villain is, or who we can trust, but we begin the tasks nevertheless. In the first of these, Geralt must show Olgierd's deceased brother Vladimir the time of his life. Geralt contacts the departed's ghost, gets possessed, and then you head to a wedding after agreeing that once it reaches midnight, Vladimir will leave. The wedding's a lot of fun for Vladimir, but also for the player, and moments like these are a big part of what makes the Witcher series what it is. Those moments where you take a break from the action to enjoy the company of others and have a good time. And the wedding certainly is a good time. Vladimir's actions are funny and made all the more so by the fact he's using a reluctant Geralt's body to carry them out. Vladimir himself is designed to contrast to Olgierd. Where Olgierd has eternal life but can enjoy nothing, Vladimir is dead but can still love life to its fullest. This contrast reinforces Olgierd's situation. The fun doesn't last, however, as Gaunter O'Dim makes a chilling appearance and reveals that Vladimir was jealous of his brother and died a coward, rather than a hero. Vladimir still isn't cowed by this, but once it reaches midnight and he ignores the deal he made with Geralt, Gaunter steps in once more, torturing the spirit and forcing him to leave. This reveals a bit more of both Gaunter's power and evilness, but he's still respectful to Geralt, and even offers the player good advice that can help to romance Shani. Regardless, having fulfilled your first wish, you can move on to the second, which involves obtaining the deed to a house and a good old-fashioned heist. The quest isn't bad, and the idea of assembling a team to help you is nice, but this still feels like the weakest part of the main story. This slump in the story doesn't last long, however, as the quest for the third wish is the best yet. Here, Geralt is tasked with finding a rose that Olgierd had given to his wife, Iris. You head to the decrepit Von Everich estate, where you're forced to fight a monstrous creature called the Caretaker, in another enjoyable boss fight. His telegraphed attacks and ability to heal through damaging you or summoned skeletons forces the player to dodge correctly, and to think about their approach and adapt their strategy to overcome the fight, rather than just relying on brute force and healing to win the battle through pure attrition. Exploring Olgierd's former house is atmospheric and starts to fill in the details of his past, which turns out to be quite the dark tale. Upon finding and burying Iris's corpse, her spirit appears and you enter a painting of the manor. In this surreal setting, we view scenes from the past that show Olgierd's and Iris's far from perfect marriage. The puzzle solving of piecing together missing parts of each scene could have been a fun and interesting activity, but instead it's wasted potential as the developers made this part way too easy. That doesn't diminish the story of this section, however, which finally allows us to understand Olgierd. Originally, he was in love with Iris, but due to his family's debts, her parents wouldn't let her marry him and instead promised her to an Aetheri prince. In anger, Olgierd cursed the prince, turning him into the toad we kill in the game's first quest. Still, this wasn't enough to gain the woman he loved's hand in marriage, and so he found a way to contact Gaunter O'Dim. Gaunter agreed to grant Olgierd's wishes of marriage, money, and immortality, but in exchange, Olgierd must sacrifice his brother Vladimir. Olgierd agreed, and his wishes were granted, but they did not bring him the happiness he had hoped. Everything we see in the painted world takes place after this. In his unhappiness, Olgierd let his marriage deteriorate, which led to Iris demanding a divorce. Olgierd refused and instead killed Iris's father and forced her to stay in the house against her wishes. Realizing his unhappiness, Olgierd tried to summon Gaunter once more to break their pact, but is unable to do so and only managed to burn part of the house down. As the lives of the couple continue to deteriorate, Olgierd eventually decides to leave the estate, leaving behind the rose that Geralt is now looking for. After learning of this from Iris, we fight a manifestation of her biggest fear, which turns out to be Olgierd. This fight's also good. If the player uses AoE or attacks the spectral forms carelessly, they will end up fighting far more enemies at once, making the fight much more challenging, and so the fight rewards careful play, which makes it feel quite unique. Once this is finished, you have a choice to take the rose from Iris and grant her peace, or leave her in this world and take a painting of the rose to use to fulfill Olgierd's wish instead. When we return to Olgierd, we instead meet Gaunter O'Dim, and it's here that the extent of his power and evilness is finally made clear to the player. In this scene, Gaunter freezes time completely, showing a use of magic far more impressive than anything we've seen before, and suggesting a level of power far beyond Geralt himself. After being repeatedly interrupted by a drunken man, Gaunter kills him with a spoon in what must be the most memorable and disturbing death scene in the series. Having seen the full extent of Gaunter's power and evilness, and having learnt of Olgierd's past, the player now has a much better understanding of what's going on, but you're still left being full of uncertainty on how this story will end, and that ending is soon approaching. You have one more optional objective to learn more of Gaunter O'Dim from a tormented professor named Shakeslock. But after that, all that's left is the final confrontation with Olgierd and Gaunter. Here, Gaunter is revealed to have fulfilled his side of the pact with Olgierd, to fulfill 3 of his wishes and stand together on the moon, which is shown to have been painted upon the stone where Olgierd now stands. Having fulfilled his pact, Gaunter is now entitled to Olgierd's soul, unless the player intervenes. Before going any further, this seems a good time to talk about the 2 main characters, Gaunter O'Dim and Olgierd von Everec. Gaunter is a fantastic character for several reasons. As a villain, he feels truly dangerous and intimidating. He's not someone who can just be defeated in combat, and by pitting the player against a character like this, the game does a great job at making the player feel small and insignificant. It's a perfect reminder that even though you just defeated the Wild Hunt and saved the world, there are still things out there you don't understand, and enemies you won't always be able to easily overcome. This is reinforced by his mannerisms, where he acts polite and respectful, talking more like a lawyer than a typical villain, and only showing signs of his power rarely because he knows he has nothing to prove. And the power of Gaunter O'Dim is still left as a mystery. We've seen his abilities in action, and these do suggest he's incredibly powerful, but he still needed Geralt's help to complete his pact with Olgierd, and he can still be defeated. So he is powerful, but in no way is he omnipotent, despite what his initials might spell out. Whether he is omnipresent is another question. He shows up as a hidden background NPC more times than you probably realise. His danger seems to come from his ability to know so much and to outsmart those around him, to use wordplays and things only he knows to trick others and get what he wants. But his power, it seems, is constrained by rules and contracts, as the story shows. And so too is his evilness, unless he's not quite the evil incarnate that Professor Shakeslock thinks he is. Gaunter has immense power, but he doesn't use that power to create as much suffering as possible. Instead, he seems to operate by his own set of rules, punishing only those that he seems to think deserve it. When he tortures Vladimir, it's only after Vladimir breaks his word about returning at midnight. When he kills the man with a spoon, it's only after being repeatedly interrupted. When he curses Marlene in Blood and Wine, it's after she ignores an old rule for hospitality to beggars. And with Olgierd, well, we'll get to him soon, but it seems clear that Gaunter isn't only concerned with causing suffering and doing evil deeds, because he has the power to do so much more than what he does. And so, by our standards of morality, he may seem evil, but perhaps that's not because he lacks a moral compass. Maybe it's simply because he has a very different set of morals. One where honesty is the most important thing, and rules should never be broken. Or he can be interpreted differently. There's certainly enough signs that can be used to draw comparisons with the devil, and perhaps Gaunter is an evil that punishes other evil, and that's what guides his actions. One common reoccurring theme with Master Mirror is reflection, which is even the solution to the final riddle. Perhaps Gaunter reflects the evil hidden within humanity back at it, or he just reflects the flaws in people's desires. Or perhaps he's motivated by nothing but his own personal enjoyment. Perhaps contracts and pacts are just a means to this enjoyment, a way for him to entertain himself by not simply toying with others' lives, but by outsmarting other people as he does so. Perhaps he doesn't even need to follow their rules. Maybe he is deliberately constraining his power through these contracts just to make things more interesting, like playing a game on a harder difficulty setting. In the end, it's hard to say exactly what motivates this character, but there is a consistency to his actions, and clearly more to him than just doing evil for evil's sake. And that's part of what makes him so fascinating, that it feels like there is so much more to him we don't know, and that every scene he's in feels both unpredictable but believable. As a result, he's a hugely entertaining and intimidating villain. And then there's Olgierd, the man with the heart of stone. Although as the title of the DLC is plural, it clearly also refers to Gaunter O'Dim. Anyway, Olgierd is also a great and complex character. It surprises me how sympathetic many people are towards Olgierd, but that's part of what makes him interesting, that people do respond quite differently to his story. But we shouldn't be too quick to forgive him. He has done bad things, such as banditry and cursing the Ophiri prince, before ever meeting Gaunter O'Dim, and upon meeting him, he willingly sacrificed the life of his brother to get what he wanted. And that is why he made the pact. It wasn't to save Iris, it was for himself, for greed. That's why he didn't simply wish for Iris's happiness, or for only the chance to marry her, but also for money and immortality. And perhaps Olgierd's Heart of Stone wasn't given to him by Gaunter O'Dim, but was instead created by himself. Consider this. If you gain everything you want in life, but in order to get it you had to kill a person you love, say your brother, do you really think you could enjoy those things you wanted so bad now you actually have them? Or instead, would every time you see them, every time you try to enjoy them, would you be reminded of your guilt? Would the fact that you only got these things by doing something truly terrible ever leave you? Or would it haunt you to the end of your days? That is the situation Olgierd found himself in. That is why when we see him outside with Iris, he can't truly be happy, because how could he enjoy his marriage knowing what he'd done to get it? And with no way to ever repent or atone for his sins, how could he ever move past that? And then there is his immortality. Our mortality is what makes us human. It is something that gives meaning to both the good and the bad that we experience, as we know our experiences are limited by time. When we know these experiences are infinite, how could they ever have as much meaning, or bring the same amount of satisfaction? And with a life with no danger, how could there be excitement? Olgierd had nothing to live for. All the good things he had hoped for were ruined by his guilt, and no new experiences could hold true meaning due to his immortality. And so he lost his own humanity. He cared nothing for others and lived his life completely numb, with a heart of stone. But he should not be absolved of responsibility simply because of the involvement of Gaunter. He chose his path. He created his Heart of Stone, and he holds some degree of blame for every bad thing he did. Or does he? I think Olgierd is guilty of a great deal, but I've seen others who are completely willing to forgive him, who either interpret the events as all being orchestrated by Gaunter O'Dim. Therefore, Olgierd's Heart of Stone is something caused by Gaunter to deliberately change Olgierd, and Olgierd should not be held responsible and deserves forgiveness. Others consider Olgierd's suffering as having been enough to forgive him, regardless of how much responsibility for his situation he holds. And it's these differences of opinion that make Olgierd so great. Is he a victim, or just a lesser evil than Gaunter? He reached this situation through his own free will, but should that mean he's held accountable? Was his Heart of Stone something Gaunter tricked him into having, or is it a natural consequence of his guilt and immortality, or is there even a difference? And of course, even if Olgierd is evil, even if it's all his own fault, and even if he is guilty, does he, or anyone for that matter, deserve this fate? To not only die, but to have his soul taken, and presumably be destined to eternal damnation, whatever that entails in the Witcher universe. And finally, is it worth risking yours, or Geralt's life over? Is it really smart to oppose a figure such as Master Mirror? It all makes this choice an interesting one, but if there is one big weakness of Hearts of Stone, it's also this choice. The risk this choice entails isn't real, and we know that. We are the main character. We know we'll be okay eventually. We know we can defeat Gaunter somehow because we know this is a game, and games always let us win. Hearts of Stone does so much to stand out as a great story that escapes so many of its medium's usual pitfalls, but in this moment the story is very much limited by being a video game. If I was faced with this choice in real life, I would never intervene. If Book Geralt was faced with this choice, I'm fairly sure he wouldn't intervene. But playing through this, I did intervene because I knew the risk wasn't real, and doing so sounded more fun. And maybe you're better at role-playing than me. Maybe the risk did seem real to you. But for me, this choice didn't elicit the response the story demanded, because it's a video game, and I knew it's a video game. and I think the story is weakened slightly as a result. Opposing and outsmarting Gaunter O'Dim shouldn't be easy, but it is, and his character is slightly reduced as a result. He feels less intimidating after you see how easy he is to defeat, and somewhat less interesting. The section where you solve the riddle is decent though. The riddle itself is good, although the way to solve it is unfortunately pretty boring. It's more about whether you find the right spot to interact with than realising the answer, which is a shame, although the sequence still feels intense. The way things are placed to distract you, like Shani or the sword, is a great touch. The area with all the gold in particular. It actually does prey on the player's real greed. Even knowing it's designed to distract you, a part of me still really wanted to pick it all up, and by producing a real response from the player, the situation is made more realistic and effective as a result. But in the end, the riddle is easy to solve and Gaunter is easy to defeat, and that doesn't feel like how this story should end. Gaunter's last words can be translated, and roughly mean, "You're not as important as you think you are, you haven't really won, I can't die and I'll be back." So future consequences might be implied, but it still feels too easy, and the player's victory doesn't feel deserved in my eyes. But that's the only real complaint I have with this story, and it in no way diminishes all the good things about it. And Gaunter O'Dim is still a fantastic character, who's both evil but likeable, and makes this story a joy to play through. And like all good fairy tales, this story feels like it can function as a parable, with some very real warnings behind it. The most obvious of these is as a warning against greed, and a reminder to be careful what you wish for. Just as in the short story The Monkey's Paw, Gaunter O'Dim gives you what you wish for, not what you actually want, and the distinction between these is relevant in reality too. Are you sure what you think you want is what you actually want? Or is it just a means to an end, that it isn't guaranteed and could be reached some other way? And if a story is a warning, it could also be a warning against desire itself, and excess passion. It's love that gets Olgierd in trouble. Love that causes him to curse the prince, and to find the man of glass, and to sacrifice his brother. The most human of emotions is what ends up costing him his humanity. But perhaps he was too passionate. If he instead moved on, both Iris and he may have found happiness. Maybe they just weren't destined to be together. Maybe love isn't always the most important thing, and too much passion can easily be someone's downfall. If love can lead to stalking, suicide, or contacting and summoning demonic entities in order to form a pact, well, maybe it's time to move on instead. And we can't talk about warnings without looking at the role of contracts and pacts in this story. Contracts are everywhere in this DLC, and they all seem to have bad consequences. Firstly with the Witcher contract to kill the Toad, then with the pact Geralt is forced to make with Gaunter, but also at the wedding. Marriage is a contract, and Vlodomir's probing questions and Gaunter's departing words certainly make it seem like this contract might be less of a blessing and more of a curse for the newlyweds. And once more in the heist quest, the situation has all been created by a contract, the details of a will that specified the brothers should share the auction house, which leads to one betraying the other and eventually a whole lot of people being killed. And finally, in the quest at the Von Everich estate, we again see the role of a marriage contract being central to how events play out. It is the desire for this contract that gets these characters into this situation, and it's the marriage contract that ends up trapping Iris and leading to Olgierd murdering her father, which is the turning point in the couple's downfall into the nightmare they end up in. Contracts themselves might claim to be fair, but maybe that illusion of fairness is what makes them so dangerous. Their strict rules can trap and chain us just as easily as help us, and sometimes the small print can have a large impact. Maybe it's not just a deal with the devil we should be careful about, but the fact that contracts can have unintended consequences, and that we always need to be careful what we're getting ourselves in for, and whether the person on the other side of the table knows something we don't. And this story also features questions of free will, of determinism and fate, of religion and the afterlife, of morality, mortality, and the relationship between the two. And then there's how this story functions as a retelling of classic tales. Hearts of Stone is clearly heavily influenced by both Faustian tales, in particular the Polish Mr. Twardowski, and also the German fairy tale Heart of Stone. But there's also other clear influences. We have Toad princes and Lovecraftian elements in Shakespeare's story, as well as pop culture references such as the name of Gaunt Rodin being taken from Stephen King's Dark Tower series. And if that's a big part of The Witcher's appeal, its ability to draw from folklore and fairy tales to create its own blend and provide its own twist on things we already know, then Hearts of Stone is one of the smoothest and richest examples of this within the series. And so there are plenty of reasons to enjoy this story. And that's good, because outside of the story, this DLC doesn't have much to offer. Of course it doesn't need to. It's more than reasonably priced, and doing one thing very well is more than enough to make up for not doing much else. There are several new points of interest, which look okay and have a few nice stories in the form of treasure hunts to go with them, but they're really just more of the same, and that same is something the base game was already full of. The zone around Novigrad looks fine, but it doesn't feel like anything especially new. There are a couple new enemy types, but mostly you'll be fighting Fallen Knights, which are just humans. The same old boring humans over and over that you've already fought hundreds of in the base game, and that fact makes clearing out points of interest here get pretty boring pretty quick. There are a few new side quests, but they are a few, and again feel like more of the same, with no real standouts and the same weaknesses of those in the base game. The Rune Rite should have been an interesting addition. Introducing a big money sink made sense, and runes had the potential to open up more customization of your builds and playstyle. In reality though, this was poorly executed. Most runes are boring and weak, whereas Severance, the rune that expands the range of Whirl and Rend, is somewhat overpowered. The cost of the Rune Rite is also way too high for what it unlocks, and the fact that you can't even see the things you're paying to unlock makes the already too high cost even more egregious. But these are minor issues, because they are a minor part of the DLC. Hearts of Stone is fantastic. It takes full advantage of being DLC to deliver something more focused and more deliberate. The result may be the best story told within the Witcher games, and it's certainly the best written. But if you went into this experience wanting more of the things that made you love The Witcher 3, it is possible Hearts of Stone may fail to deliver. If, say, you wanted to recapture that feeling of going on an epic adventure, with new lands to explore that were packed full of new content to just get completely lost in all over again, well, if that was the case, your disappointment would be short-lived.
Toussaint, the land of love and wine.
Exactly how I remembered it.
You will find Beauclair's changed some these past years.